Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives.
Have Kufikiri Hiari Imara. He'll be talking on entheogenic emergence. Where are we now and where are going as a broadening community as it relates to various ecosystems viewed from a cultural perspective of socially marginalized communities? Kufikiri was born and raised in Oakland, California. He grew up in an Oakland very different than the one we see today. It was an Oakland with a broader and more embodied sense of community. Grew up the youngest in a household with parents who are both Bay Area natives, both of them born in San Francisco, as well as both his parents growing up were active in the civil rights and Black Power movements of the San Francisco of the 1960s and 70s. He grew up in a home and community environment that strongly emphasized social awareness and social responsibility. Play that forward to an older, wiser individual who unfolded his path through a love of the arts and his own personal healing and spiritual journey. That path led him to volunteer work with Green Earth Poet Society, bringing poetry to incarcerated African-American youth. He is one of the early members of the Entheogen Integration Circle, a support group in NYC with a focus on marginalized communities within the psychedelic community. He is currently involved with Sacred Garden community, having completed their facilitators workshop, which aids him in deepening his work as a ceremonial facilitator, working with ethnically diverse communities. One of the reasons he got involved with the Decriminalize Nature Oakland initiative was to support effective access. As the former head of the DNO committee focused on outreach, education, access, and integration, he worked to encourage broad access to the education and opportunity to profoundly change one's life for the better through working with entheogens. Paying special attention to Oakland's ethnically diverse and marginalized communities, he is actively working with individuals and organizations doing the work in these communities for a better tomorrow. Access has always been his message and was the focus of his talk when he spoke at the CIIS Chacruna Symposium, Cultural and Political Perspectives on Psychedelic Science in August 2018 in San Francisco, as well as his talk hosted by the San Francisco Psychedelic Society in March 2019. He continues to work towards accessible choices for ethnically diverse and marginalized communities and their ability to heal themselves. Kufikiri, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Psych.
Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you. Okay. First, I want to offer an acknowledgement of this larger moment we finding ourselves in collectively. And in honor of lives lost, whose names are known, whose names are not known, who maybe have lost their lives as a number. My offering. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening sky. Let it resound loud as the roaring Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. A moment of silence. My name is Kufikiri Hiari Imara. I was born and raised in what is Huichin, land of the Ohlone people, now called Oakland, California. I acknowledge the struggle of all the indigenous people. However I choose to show up, I choose to do so lending my voice towards progress, informed by my own personal and spiritual journey of healing. Thank you to the organizers of this event for allowing this platform for voices to be heard, to be able to speak to important issues. The title I chose, Where Are We Now and Where Are We Going? As a broadening community, as it relates to various ecosystems, viewed from a cultural perspective of socially marginalized communities. I chose that because there is a lot that is unfolding in this moment. And in that emergence, there is still a lot of conversation that is taking place where we are building the language around how to have such conversations about where we are going. So I offer my perspective in those conversations. I'm going to speak about the various ecosystems as they relate within the quote unquote larger psychedelic community, though I am not necessarily the biggest fan of the word psychedelic and prefer entheogen, understanding that that's what most people use and recognize. In the various ecosystems that exist, I'm going to look at where we have medical clinical, where we have university and research, where we have enterprise, where we have community, some would consider underground, where we have indigenous and cultural, and where we have political. These are all various ecosystems that have already existed in their own manner previous to where we find ourselves, though the course of events over the past year and more have done a great deal to shift these ecosystems into an unfamiliar space, as unfamiliar individuals, organizations, entities, elements are also entering into the community and the space. One thing that's interesting that I find about the process of emergence is that it's a growth process. Now, I'm a big believer in that there's no coincidence that they're called growing pains and not growing tickles. And to that, this emergence that we're in, this growth process that we're in, the growing pains that are being experienced and how we're collectively navigating them, even though in our own ecosystems, it will, in my opinion, be very important how there can be greater solidarity amongst those efforts. Similar to an example of like emergence of like a bike ride. For the experience of a bike ride to happen, it takes both the rider and the bike. The greater the relationship between the two, the greater the potential. I don't believe that's much different around solidarity in where how we are working together can be better supported. One moment to my notes. One thing that I find interesting that seems to be part of this emergence, part of this moment, in the introductions that are happening in non-familiar relationships that are being built for those that are looking to enter into the space and those that are looking to branch out from it, is where a community that to a certain extent and for a certain period of time, in part due to efforts by the government, lived in its niche spacing, though it was not isolated from society. So where we are seeing the challenges of society to navigate itself. We are also seeing those challenges present in this emergence of the psychedelic community as it broadens. I spoke to similar themes in other talks I've given around the internalized false belief systems and blind spots that exist that perpetuate systems of oppression and systems that don't encourage access, for lack of a better term. Now, how that relates to the various ecosystems that I've mentioned, coming from a cultural perspective, starting with where I mentioned medical and clinical, it is well documented the challenges that exist for marginalized communities as it relates to fair access to treatment in the medical and clinical field, let alone in what is emerging as it relates to psycho-assisted therapy, where there is still not a great deal, in my opinion, of the needed attention around how this issue will be addressed. Leaving something to that degree unaddressed, it will do, as I feel, where a lot of people call this a renaissance, will actually move this into more of a feeling like a rebellion and possibly even a revolution, given that the larger moment that we find ourselves in is not disconnected from the emergence that is taking place. That is similarly true as it relates to universities and a lot of the research, the issues around diversity in staff, in pools, yet no conversation, no attention given. And I think the one that is most forward-leaning is enterprise, as there are a great deal of interests in where this emergence is also an economic emergence. And in that, where there is a more of an emphasis around building economic relationships as opposed to cultural relationships, the tendency for what I consider sacrament, which is only available to us because of the indigenous land stewards which have shepherded this knowledge along for centuries in the face of genocide, will still be left fighting for their rights and constitutional recognition as this economic emergence looks to benefit off of that. Now, it's not to say that economics hasn't always existed, it's just to the degree. Those who grow, or those who hold space, or those who do fly-in retreats, or those who work in research, or those who work in policy. Economics has always existed to that degree, but to the degree that it's moving the iceberg above the water surface and more of it is being exposed, there will be a moment of apex and then it will recede again. And what will that transition of the emergence look like as it relates to community, as it relates to those who work in what is considered the underground? And that is very important because that is where a lot of the cultural bridges and ties that currently exist are strongest. And so an acknowledgement and an understanding of the importance of those cultural bridges is, again, a conversation that I do not feel gain gets as much attention as it should. And that, for me, also then leads us to where a lot of this emergence has been accelerated over the past year or two, and that is with what we're seeing as psychedelic politics. And that happening from local municipalities all the way up to state level with an intention and a focus to move to federal level. Though some efforts are happening with certain organizations that are looking to create market and go to market. And that's happening in other ways for individuals who are just looking to focus on political action around changing laws and regulations. I feel we're in a moment around this entheogenic emergence where psychedelics is akin to where cannabis was in the 90s, politically and in kind of the social knowledge space of the general public. Though where cannabis is now, it won't take psychedelics that long as the people would know it to move to where cannabis is from where it was in the 90s, given cannabis precedent. And so in that, while the two are not the same, there are great lessons to be learned from how things progressed in the emergence in cannabis politically that I hope we can learn from and not repeat such mistakes, so that the conversations that need to happen in the medical clinical, in universities and research, in enterprise, in the community and underground, in the indigenous and cultural traditions can be heard in those areas and arenas as well. How we address those internalized false belief systems and blind spots that perpetuate old systems when new worlds are looking to be built will be very telling of how this emergence unfolds going forward. This is a moment with the potential to become a movement. So what will we do with the opportunity? I don't believe it requires reinventing the wheel. Community experience that already exists is a great resource of wisdom and knowledge. Though if we do not move at the pace of trust, at the speed of medicine, we could, like the cannabis community, find ourselves having to backtrack and undo efforts that can impede progress. I heard, if I'm paraphrasing here, Anne Shogan once say, psychedelics are like the shiny rainbow, sparkly rainbow to the shadow, and a lot of folks get stuck at the rainbow and don't go in and do the actual shadow work. Akin to spiritual bypass. I hope we do not have a bypass of the potential of this moment, and we are actually willing and able to invest ourselves in the work that is needed and that is called for in this moment. Thank you.
Hi, Kufikiri. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate the insights, perspectives, and the music as well. I'd love to, hear some of your thoughts on what does that, what do those beginning conversations look like, and that relationship building look like, especially in this time of COVID, where people are geographically separated, hindering us from being able to, in many ways, engage with one another in more dimensions than just dialogue.
I feel oftentimes the best place to start, if for anyone who is looking to engage in building relationship, is to start with the work of the relationship with themselves. Because oftentimes we are not available to come into opportunity to engage with someone from a place of listening, because we are engaged in our own internal conversation. And we may actually miss not just hearing what the other is saying, though really listening to what they are saying. And so, you know, I really feel listening is a lost art. And that is something you can practice with yourself all the time. You can practice it with your family and friends. And that is something that doesn't need necessarily to be in the same physical space as someone, because we can connect energetically, even in a virtual sense, so that there can be a sharing where even those small exchanges can be the shift, where the dominant culture likes to celebrate the strength of aggression. And as we cultivate a greater awareness around the strength of vulnerability, that so helps with heart-centered listening and building relationship. The little efforts that we can make in our own lives, I think can do a lot more for building a foundation about that, as opposed to looking at just more great big efforts. So how we show up in our lives, listening to ourselves and listening to those that are immediately around us, help us be able to listen to those that we may have a feeling is different or apart from us, but then once we're able to engage with them, find the similarities.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. On that point of, you know, engaging with folks who are listening, there's individuals that I've met, many who don't want to even engage. And I'm wondering about your perspectives on, especially when they come with a culture of aggression, with immense amounts of power, whether that's capital or relationships, whatever it might be. How do we engage with those folks who maybe are misaligned with the movement that so many individuals in this space are trying to create? How do we engage with those individuals? Do we engage? Do we separate ourselves and focus again on ourselves and our communities and our work? Or do we try to bring them into the conversation as well?
I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic as things go forward, as this moment continues to broaden and the community continues to build out and interest to enter into the community grows as well. And I think that those type of conversations of those individuals, similar to the kind of ecosystems I was speaking to, will color those type of conversations. Because if it's someone that's coming from an environment that has conditioned them to be of an aggressive nature, and that is coloring their interactions, which don't benefit them for individuals in this community, you know, if it's someone coming from like a research background or someone coming from like a political or economic background, I think it's a telling sign, one, how much they're willing to listen and suspend their own judgments and opinions and engage. And if they're not willing to do so, I think that's just pretty telling of itself about the potential to be able to build on that type of relationship. And so where there's the willingness to be able to be open to where you may not know everything, so then you're willing to open and receive things and see the value in other people's perspectives. I think it's somewhat situational where that can be done. I don't think it's going to be like like a cookie cutter way of doing it. Though a lot of the efforts I do see that are emerging in this moment, where there are conversations around what do best practices look like when someone wants to be in solidarity with individuals in the community that are working towards progress and the benefit of others, where there can be an opportunity for that. Again, it's situational, but the more that working towards that solidarity can happen, I think for the better.
Mm-hmm. And in cases where we are examining ourselves, and confronting, those shadow sides, that possible aggression, and we might inflict that on other individuals, what do you feel like has, in your experiences, been I guess, how to phrase this. What are ways that we can ask for forgiveness from one another for the aggression that we might introduce, because we sometimes just haven't done the work necessary to be able to engage in that, but want to re-engage now with knowing that that's something we have to shift within ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's a really interesting one. It for me really encapsulates how this moment is one, this emergence is one that's so highlighting where there are great benefits for healing to take place, yet it's also highlighting how much healing needs to take place for that emergence and opportunity to happen at the same time. And those are two processes that are both having their own bit of discovery and introduction, and how to navigate them is really a self-informed process that's moving organically in this moment. And I feel like that's one of those conversations where we're building the language while we're having it, because it's not an easy conversation. It's challenging when you're triggered and someone's there saying something that you don't agree with. When we don't always have the opportunity to flex those muscles of how we would respond, it's easy to say so when we're staring at our phone on social media, to be like, I would have done this, I would have done that. So when you're actually in a moment of being triggered and you're having an emotional response, we don't often actually have those opportunities to flex those muscles of, how do I want to navigate this moment? How do I not respond from being triggered? How do I respond to this from a place that makes it most beneficial for everyone? Like, we don't really have those opportunities because, again, we live in a society that promotes the strength of aggression, not the strength of vulnerability, not listening, but talking. A lot of talking, not a lot of listening. So it's going to be really interesting because I don't have a specific answer for that. And I feel like that's a conversation that will start to take shape as this moment goes forward. So it'll be really interesting to see what that looks like.
Definitely. Kufikiri, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for sharing your insights and everything you have to offer. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so very much for the opportunity and the platform to raise such important issues. I greatly appreciate it, and wishing all the best to all the organizers and everyone speaking and everyone out there listening. Love and light. Be well.
Yeah, same to you, Kufikiri. Thank you.
Thank you.